So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the session on user citizens and the role of DPGs and G20 and all of that. And so we're going to have, a panel here which will be discussing the issues relating to the topic. And I have an esteemed panel here, starting from the extreme left, Shoko Noda from UNDP. We have Beat Esterman from Switzerland, who's a professor of public transformation. We have Kim Jeong-gon from the Korea Institute of Economic Policy. We have Abhishek Singh, who's from National eGov, MyGov, and Digital India. So all possible combinations. And Prajakta Kovalekar, who is with the DPG Alliance. And I'm Sanjay Anandram from iSpirit. All of a sudden, in the past few years, DPGs have become the talk of town. Until recently, I think in 2017, the word DPG got coined. And in 2019, the United Nations came up with this whole phrase of DPGs and SDGs and all of that. Prior to that, there was no real idea about or a model for what a DPG ought to be. And India, prior to that, had started from 2009-10, implemented DPGs at scale without knowing it was DPG, starting from Aadhaar and then cashless, presence-less, UPI, et cetera, and the phenomenal success at scale, at scope, and unbelievable use conditions that was not seen before ever, and continues to be the largest set of deployments in the world. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to do is we'll have a series of topics that we will have expert comments on. We'll keep it conversational, and then we can interject and sort of take the discussions forward. So I'll move on first to Abhishek. Given the India experience with the entire so-called India stack, starting from identity to payments to lending to a whole host of things. What has been your experience at deploying these DPGs at scale, and what are the principles that you can abstract that are relevant for use around the world? From the idea of not just DPG, from a sovereignty standpoint as well, because the underlying assumption of these things is that given the nature of the world we live in today, sovereignty becomes a very critical element of all such decisions.
Thank you, Sanjay, and it's indeed a pleasure to be on this forum and interacting with this esteemed panel on the ever so important topic of digital public goods. And as Sanjay, you rightly mentioned, DPGs is a term which is being used for something that we have been doing for quite some time. It's primarily use of technology to empower citizens, use of technology to improve public delivery of public services, and use of technology to ultimately improve governance. And when we started way back in 2009, if I can say, like when we had just started with the National E-Governance Plan, and then we were trying to find out what are the key bottlenecks which prevents us from leveraging technology as it's being done in other sectors. We found that identity was one key problem which was not allowing people to access financial services, access credit, access any other kind of service when it comes to getting government benefits. We also realized that not having a clear proof of identity led to a lot of leakages in public governance systems, and for better targeting of services, we needed something to establish one's identity which helps them to access services. And while doing so, when the design of the project, of the Aadhaar project was being done, the core principles, which may later on we can say that become basic tenets of digital public goods, was that it has to be simple, it has to be architected in such a way that it's scalable, it's robust, it's open, based on open standards, based on open source software systems. It's based on open APIs, which allows exchange of information through and allows verification of services. It should be interoperable, and it should be something which is minimalist. Like, for example, to get an Aadhaar number, you required very minimal kind of elements that was required. And then, of course, the storyline goes that after Aadhaar, we came up with UPI, which revolutionized the way we do digital payments. And there also these basic tenets of open standards, open source, and interoperability was built in. Like, how do you enable even small value financial transactions between various financial institutions? Then we came up with something like DigiLocker, which again allowed seamless exchange of documents between various systems. So that citizens, instead of running as courier systems, getting documents from one government system, submitting to another, the government systems start talking to each other. Again, based on same interoperable, open standards, robust, scalable kind of architecture. So that has been the basic tenets, and on top of that, now health services with the UHI coming in, agriculture services, educational services are being built in. So I would say that the basic tenets of digital public goods will remain, especially with India's experience, is that they should be done in a scalable manner, they should be robust, they should be based on open standards and open source, and they should be interoperable. And of course, the last and not the least point will be that it should be based on consent of the citizens, so that when data or information of any citizen which has been collected for a particular service is being shared with any other system with any other system or a department, so that he can access, citizen can access service of that department, consent of the citizen should be taken in. So these are the basic principles on which we have like kind of designed our digital public goods, and this has led to large-scale digital transformation in almost all walks of life in India.
Great, thanks, Abhishek. I'll come to you, Prajakta, now, because you're with the DPG Alliance, which looks at things in a more global sort of landscape. These principles that Abhishek talked of, these tenets, do you want to add to it? What has been your experience through DPGA?
Sure. So what the DPGA does, let me just quickly mention that. We basically have a digital public goods standard, and the Digital Public Goods Alliance essentially stewards that standard, right? And everything that Abhishek just mentioned, all those tenets of interoperability, scalability, no vendor lock-ins, all of those tenets basically come to life in the DPG standard. And it comes to life through various, some technical, some non-technical indicators, but largely the spirit behind the standard, so that we actually build global but deploy local is, there should be no vendor lock-in, there should be no proprietary sort of lock-in that, keeps the product from not scaling up. There are also do no harm by design practices. So there are, even though you're building and deploying locally, you're thinking about international best practices for design, which do no harm. And a lot of these have also come from the UN Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap, right? And as per that, even applicable laws, both domestic and international, are thought of while doing the governance of the digital public good. All of these sort of indicators that we call it in the digital public good standard are standardizations to ensure digital public goods across the world look the same and behave the same, and can then,
So when you
create
say
digital public
look the same, you mean from an architecture standpoint?
Yes.
Not
yes.
user interface?
No. I mean not user interface. From technology standpoint, they, behave similarly and therefore interact with one another.
Got it.
Right? To create larger digital public infrastructure.
Right. So from the standpoint, again, coming to you, Biat, about the digital sovereignty bit and about your role as in charge of public transformation projects. What are your thoughts, particularly from Switzerland's point of view? How do you see this whole thing, and what are the important things that you want to highlight, if at all?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry, the microphone. Yeah, thank you. I think what has been said is already quite a good basis. In Switzerland, we orient ourselves with regard to the European Union and EFTA with the Tallinn principles for e-government development. And very important aspects in there is like the use of open source software and creating reusable IT services and solutions, so that your approach of this digital public goods goes exactly in this direction. On top of that, there's the idea of data sharing, like creating data spaces where we can actually share data across government, but also partly with the private sector. So I think that's a very important aspect. And very centrally is the idea of digital self-determination and bringing in this user-centeredness, and maybe also creating a balance between the interests of the individual users on one hand and what we maybe know from other systems like the US system, where you have like private enterprises and their interests, or you have like the Chinese system maybe with a stronger focus on control by government, or the European approach with a lot of regulation from the government.
Yeah.
I think like counterbalancing these three approaches by a user-centered perspective, focusing on this digital self-determination, I think that's very important. And that brings me like to the final thought on that. If we want to share these infrastructures across countries internationally, I think it's important to have this shared purpose, this shared vision of what kind of infrastructure we want to create to ensure or to secure which kind of values of being together as citizens of every country, but also as citizens of the world.
Got it. Right. And there's a fourth model which I'll talk about, since you talked about the US, China, and Europe. There's a fourth model, which is the India model. Talk about that. Coming to you from Korea.
Yeah.
You've got the experience of implementing, DPGs in Korea, my data and in Korea. Please talk to us about what the Korea experience has been with regard to the DPGs and what are the important lessons from that.
Yes. I think based on Korea's experience, citizens' rights is becoming essential issue of digital transformation. Now we are on the road to find ways how to protect citizens' rights without sacrificing digital motivation to digital innovation. That's the task of Korean government. I can say that digital sovereignty is relatively new concept in Korea because some regions, including cultural background and traditionally Korean, do not care much about giving their identification code in every commercial activities or government-related activities. So actually, we have not so care about giving my private information to other parties. But now it's changing. So typically in Korea, like many other countries, data-driven innovation has been led by some small number of platform companies. Individuals have provided their personal data to use services in a somewhat, how can I say, forceful manner. That is, without consenting a certain condition, we are not allowed to use the services at all. So as a result, and users often do not fully recognize how their data are gathered, accumulated, used, etc. So this kind of recognition is spreading among Korean people and even in Korean policymakers. So in Korea, there's some strong debates on users' right on their own data. So now we are now witnessing the government is building institutional and regulatory systems to deal with tasks arising from the simultaneous request for the drive for innovation and protection of users' rights. This is the recent stage of Korea's debate on digital sovereignty. And one important example is the introduction of my data since August this year. The concept of my data is based on EU's concept of data portability. So Korean government reformed data protection laws since 2020 to introduce my data. So as a result, now Korean individuals are entitled to the right to manage their own data, which have been under digital service providers. Now users can access freely to their own data and provide them to the third party. And secondly, the my databases businesses and government services are legally allowed. So they can, the businesses can provide the services based on a bundle of data that individuals allow them to use. For example, so new kind of financial services providers are rising as they can gather the previously scattered private financial information under the condition of users' approval. So I think one of the important Korea's lessons is from the process of legal improvement. There are very complicated legacy regulation on private information. So it takes considerable time, and it takes many, much effort among policymakers and Korean NGOs, etc. So especially financial data is quite sensitive, so it takes quite a long time to change legal regulatory system. And as a result, now financing companies have to strengthen their obligations for data protection. So now Korean firms actively participated in My Data services, even though it is just an now early stage. They are very interested in new digital businesses, but there are still ongoing issues regarding My Data. So for instance, we found that individuals still often do not exactly recognize how and where data are used by My Data businesses. So anyways, in some, Korea's effort to build circumstances for promoting digital sovereignty, as well as digital innovation is now ongoing, and My Data, I think, can provide a concrete example of a solution to such twofold tasks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. And Beat, just to take off from the point you made about the models in the world, there's the US model, which is private sector led with support from the State Department. You have the EU model, which is regulatory in nature, with, for example, a GDPR kind of regulation or Digital Markets Act and so on. And there's the China model, which is kind of a walled garden within China. There's a fourth model, which is what I would call the India model, where the government innovates in digital public innovation, whereas the digital rails are created by government, private sector innovates on top of it. And that is one of the interesting sort of new models emerging. And for example, now there is an open sourced identity platform, the world's largest global deployment of DPGs, called MOSIP, out of Bangalore. 9 countries are in various stages of adoption. 75 million IDs issued and counting. Now, rest of the world, if you take away the developed world, right, you've got 6-7 billion people who are not in the developed world, so to speak, or maybe 6 billion people. For them, the use cases are different, state capacities are different, regulatory frameworks don't exist, access to capital is an issue, and so on. And now that the G20, and India is going to become the president of the G20 starting December, and there are lots of discussions going on about it. As these DPGs move into the rest of the world, and you have examples of DHIS, for example, or Aadhaar, and so on, how do you think that the G20 can play a role in ensuring there is awareness, there is hard infrastructure enablement, soft infrastructure, which includes policy and all of that, so that the whole world, or at least most of the world, can start adopting the principles of DPGs and getting into the deployment, particularly because funding is a big issue. So, Shoko, I would love to hear from you from the United Nations DP standpoint.
Yeah, thank you very much, and very good evening to you all. Let me just start with G20. G20 countries has 60% of the world population, and also covers 75% of international trade, and 80% of the world GDP. So it's great if G20 come together and make it right. I think it has an opportunity to show to the rest of the world that DPG is the way to go. And then within the G20 countries, I must say, whether it is a developed countries or developing countries, I come from Japan, and when I look at how advanced India is, I mean, India is really ahead of this game. Aadhaar and UPI, Unified Payment Interface, it's just incredible. And when India makes it, succeeds, its scale is also very, very very, very different. So for example, Aadhaar-based direct benefit transfer has saved, you have some ideas how much it has saved? 2 lakh crore from falling into the wrong hands. I think it's just massive amount. And in August, UPI has crossed 6.5 billion transactions, August itself, and that is worth 10.7 trillion rupees. So it's massive, and I think we are really going into this digital, this DPI in full swing. Also like to share with you that the CoWIN digital platform, I understand that the audience is not only Indians, but also from other countries. CoWIN is the, to put it very easy, it's a digital platform where you can make appointments to get COVID vaccine. It's to administer the whole COVID vaccination. It has administered 2 billion vaccines or more so far, and this has. So all of us who got vaccination in India, COVID vaccination in India is registered there, and we can get digital certificate. In Japan, we cannot do, and I was meeting the Australian High Commissioner yesterday. He also said that he cannot do that in Australia. So it's really, India is ahead, and there are already other countries, including G20 country, for example, Indonesia, who would like to learn from India's example, such as CoWIN. And we just hosted, UNDP just hosted a delegation from Indonesia who was very keen to learn how the CoWIN was rolled and implemented. So there's a lot that I think India can share, and this is definitely the public good. So I think G20 is an opportunity because there are a few working groups where this digital public good will be discussed. So I think a lot of opportunities ahead.
So how would you think of the funding? Because, there's also a capacity problem, right, with regard to talent, with regard to soft infrastructure being available, which means policy, laws, regulation, then hard infrastructure, telecom networks, broadband, right, data centers, things like that. How does one think of it from a funding perspective so that countries can empower themselves by accessing capital, whether through social impact bonds or some arrangement? What would be your thoughts?
So funding, it has to come, and we cannot also expect everything coming from the government. It has to be a private, public-private sector partnership, which is very important. And we should also think that using digital technology, we can lift for example, in India, we still have 229 million people in poverty. We just published a new report which says that 415 million people have been lifted from poverty since 2005, but we still have 219 million people to be lifted. So also the budget, when you talk about financing, it should come not only from the Ministry of Information and information side, but also the social development budget has to be used so that because we will be probably talking about the digital divide and digital illiteracy, but those 219 people do not have as good access to digital technology as we do here in this room. So this is not only about the digital or technology issue, but it is a social issue. And this is how I think the funding can come from different sources.
Right. Okay. Any other quick comments from any of the other panelists?
Just on the funding part, I would like to just add on. Like whenever we look at the costs for implementing a digital transformation project, we should realize that the benefits that accrue to the national ecosystem far outweigh the marginal costs which are there. And I'll just give two small examples, like for the vaccination system, the COVID about which Shoko spoke about. Like the cost of a vaccine in India is around 700 bucks, and we give around 200 rupees to the nurse or the hospital staff who administers the vaccine per dose. 700 for the vaccine, 200 for the administration. The digital cost of the entire infrastructure, including the cloud cost, development cost, administration cost, is less than 1 rupee a dose. So, and it results in so much of convenience. Similarly, if you look at, say, for example, food public distribution system, we have a huge public distribution system in which we give food grains to almost 70% of the population. So, and we spend around close to 150,000 crores, which is, I think, $200 billion. But every year, the $200 billion goes into the food, the Food Guarantee Act, and there is an act which requires that this has to be given. So the digital cost for administrating the whole program, which allows people to have portable ration cards, which allows the entire system to track which grain is going where, is less than $1 million or something. Yeah. So it's much lesser compared to the benefits that accrue. So whenever we look of doing such a project, either we find resources internally or we approach institutions like the World Bank, ADB, and all, and funding will always be available.
Yeah. And also, I suppose there are innovative new governance structures, institutions, creation of new standards, and accessing, market makers to be able to innovate on that.
Yeah, exactly. And the whole digital public goods movement also kind of further brings it down, because there are the whole community of developers, and once the systems are being developed on open source, open standards, and the learnings which countries which have already gone ahead, whether it's Singapore or whether it's India or Korea who have done stuff in this field, they can share what their journey of implementing such projects to other countries. And then this whole coming together the world to build up a GovStack or a digital public goods alliance, or bringing together of all that has been done and putting it in a common repository, making it shareable, making it adaptable, sharing expertise which is there. Capacity you mentioned, there is a lack of capacity on almost all world over, but if there are people who have led such projects, if they can further train people and ensure that other countries also adopt, then overall the world will be a better place and digital transformation will happen at a much faster pace.
So the whole idea of collaborating, sharing is the underlying principle.
Yes,
right? With
innovating,
trust.
collaborating, and ultimately all of it contributes to the sustainable development goals, as the UN would put it.
Yeah.
And whether it's eliminating poverty or reducing corruption or bringing more transparency, or taking care of the environment, all of it comes in together. So that's what the whole philosophy, the whole approach seems to be like. Yeah.
So which brings me to an interesting point, that once let's assume that you have these DPGs being deployed in multiple countries for different use cases, all of that. And there is the citizen, the user, who has to benefit ultimately, right? That's the whole objective here. And governance improves, et cetera, but the citizen's life has to improve. But there's a lot of data and, let's say, the rights of an individual that have to also be kept in mind as you go through this whole process. And Viet, you talked about some of that earlier on. I'd like to start with you, and then over to Shoko, and then we'll come, to Kim, and then Abhishek, and you, Prajakta. Is that okay?
Yeah.
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 Yes, Viet. Viet, you want to?
I want to let me
you
introduce.
Want to speak? Okay.
Yeah?
No, I was okay. Never mind. If I started, it's all right.
You first.
Okay, I also didn't completely understand. But yeah, you actually talked a lot about this my data approach before, and I think it's very important. But what we need to move forward there, on top of like having this data infrastructures and the infrastructure for sharing, is to have a community that has a common purpose, that we actually know why we are sharing the type of data we want to put together, and that we as individuals know of the value of sharing, so we can make an informed decision about what data to share with whom, for what purpose, and that we have some sort of insurance that it will not be against our own interests in the end, or against the interests of our next generation, of our children, etc. So I think that's very important, to create some sort of a community with some shared values, with the governance structures that are kind of following these values. So we have some sort of assurance that all this IT infrastructure that we're sharing, as you describe, as we're sharing like across the world, based on open source, based on the idea of maximum positive externalities, that in the end it will be employed in a way that is beneficial to us all.
Sure.
Maybe one extra thought on the financing part. I think I totally follow your approach. It's just very important that when developing these systems that we keep in mind some kind of average user, also maybe less privileged users on a global scale, to really make sure that these positive externalities actually reach a maximum.
So the design has to be for the lowest common
population.
denominator that benefits everybody.
Exactly.
That's right.
Yeah.
Shoko?
Thanks. When we talk about either digital public goods or non-digital public goods, yes, it's open to everybody, open to all of us, but we should also remember that even a park or wherever, it has to be maintained. And there is always the human resources or just simply people, users, and the maintenance people who are there. So it's very, very important also to train those users, because and then comes to also digital literacy and so on. But for the case of CoWIN, for example, UNDP was privileged to be part of that development and implementation journey of CoWIN. We facilitated the training of over 1.2 million front workers, because they have to use it. Once we beneficiaries go and get a vaccination, there's the other side, they are using and registering us. So the users are also, they are not only the public. So it's very important to have the human resource element when we roll out digital public goods, and then also to anchor that the particular good somewhere, either within the government or within the some entity, so that it just doesn't come and evaporate sometimes.
Right.
Thank you.
Kim, do you want to add to that? About the user, citizen
Yes.
rights, data?
Let me talk about some issues of open source technologies from Korea's experience. So actually now Korea has a somewhat long history of e-government system, and which is mostly around 100% is based on open sources. So the cost effectiveness of open sources is excellent, and we are also able to secure stable, high quality. So now Korean government is developing digital platform government, which is more comprehensive digital government system, and the core concept of that project is open source technologies. So it is now just a starting point. So let me stress the importance of open sources in digital government systems. So first, if you keep using commercial solutions, the government will be influenced by the ownership of commercial solutions. So true sovereignty can be secured only when it is built on open sources where anyone can see the content of the code. And the second is efficiency. In addition to cost factors, as I mentioned, new technologies are coming out every day, and only open source technology can quickly accept such a new trend. So open source is effective in terms of both demand and supply of technologies. The third is transparency. I think transparency is linked to competitiveness too, and it is transparent only when anyone can take the source code and reproduce it. Transparency is an important factor. And lastly, I want to stress the persistence. open source is very effective in updating and improving the government system persistently. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Abhishek?
Just like I was really listening to in his comments about open source, and I fully agree with what all he said about open source. And when we are building digital public goods on open source, another thing which it leads to, like when you design a system on open source technologies, it automatically drives innovation. Because the moment it's a proprietary software, it's limited to a development by a fixed set of developers. The moment you go on the open source community, the whole community of developers is accessible to you, and any project which adopts open source benefits from that, and it helps in constant improvement, fixing of bugs, doing same things more efficiently, as you mentioned, and reducing costs and improving performance. So that's one of the values which
The underlying infrastructure of the internet is all open source.
yes, yes, and most successful systems like are based on open source, and there are a few people like naysayers who would raise issues about security and all. But what I have observed, my limited experience has been that open source systems end up to become more secure than proprietary systems, because there are always a group of developers who are looking into finding out any gaps or plugging in those loopholes which might be existing. So that helps in making systems more secure. Only one point I would like to add on the overall theme of digital public goods is that at every forum I have participated in with regard to digital, there is a broad consensus. There is no like second opinion without pushing forward the agenda of digital public goods. The question remains is not why and what, but the question is how. So how do we kind of fast forward this process? How do we ensure that linkages are built in? How do we ensure that people get to learn about what is being done elsewhere, and kind of build up institutional mechanisms so that government to government sharing happens, the experts who are there are able to talk to experts in other countries, the collaboration happens at the companies level, collaboration happens at the government level. So that's what we need to work out, and towards that objective, the India Stack.global initiative, which our Prime Minister launched in July of this year, seeks to enable that, which lists down the core 12 projects that we have initiated as the first phase on India's offering to the digital public goods repository, and then it also gives in the steps required if any other country wants to adopt that.
So it's like a playbook that's available.
Yeah, it's available. All the details, documentation, GitHub codes, all of it is made available wherever it's there. And the second thing is also is that that portal is not only in English, but it's also there in all UN languages, including Mandarin, Russian, and Spanish, French. So all 6 UN languages, Arabic also, it's all covered. So the countries or those representatives who are here, they can always seek to us, the contact persons are mentioned there, and kind of start taking steps with regard to
IndiaStack.global.
IndiaStack.global is the portal there. So that would help fast forwarding adoption. We already have got a lot of requests from several countries, and I'm sure as we go ahead and as we work with UNDP and Digital Public Goods Alliances, this whole movement will become stronger and bigger.
Thanks. Quick
I'm going to go back to users again because I'm a product manager. But, how do we make user-centric sort of digital public goods or digital public infrastructure? We talked about data access earlier, right? And a couple of times in this conference and beyond, I've heard people have become just products that fear. So I think without people's consent and without defining what is personally identifiable information and what data is actually public good, right? If we do these two things and bring users into the consent framework, right, I think it really moves the needle, because at the end of the day, you also need trust and inclusion while we bring this agenda forward and, make it global.
Right.
So.
And I just want to add to that, the India approach to the idea of consent is not just a privacy-based thing, it's an empowerment-based thing. The second aspect is that we have created a piece of code, which is a technology artifact, which ensures that policy is actually implemented as opposed to policy residing on a piece of paper, right? So implementing that through technology, so it's the spine of the policy, which is actually technology enabled. So it's very, very, it's almost like a blockchain level, it's immutable, right? And that's what gives it the trust. Otherwise, every policy is open to manipulation, right? So Any questions from the audience? Yeah, what I'd like you to do, kindly please, get to a mic, state your name, your affiliation, and keep your questions very brief and precise.
Hello. Hi, my name is Dipanshu Singh. I'm a public policy advisor for the government of Uttar Pradesh. And interestingly, I was listening about the COVID, quite a few mentions. And I had the privilege of working on the ground during COVID pandemic with COVID.
If you don't mind, please keep your
Yeah.
question brief.
So my question is, we talk about digital public goods, but I have myself faced that when you go to the remote areas, there's a problem of last mile connectivity. So how do we ensure that?
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Next question. The lady here in front, yeah.
Hi, my name is Anushka. I'm a public policy consultant. My question is specifically to Mr. Singh. So you spoke about collaboration as an underlying principle of DPG. However, India has recently seen a rise in regulatory compliances, especially for tech companies and startups in the past few years. So how does the regulator, plan to sort of navigate this situation, because companies are taking a step back when it comes to increased compliance costs? Thank you.
Okay, last question and then we can answer all three. Yes, please.
My name is Anup Kumar Das. I'm from JNU, and my question is related to DPG, which is not practiced in Ministry of Education platforms like SWAYAM. So they are having backend Microsoft. So do you have any plan to migrate to open source mode?
Thank
So
you.
thank you.
Okay, three questions. First was about the last mile connectivity. The second was about the idea about increasing regulatory compliances for startups and other such companies. And the third was about SWAYAM moving on from proprietary to open source. So I think you're the best qualified to answer that.
Yeah, very interesting questions. In fact, the first one is the most important. Like, how do you ensure that digital inclusion is ensured? How do you ensure last mile connectivity? Towards that objective, yes, we do need robust fiber-based connectivity towards all our panchayats, to all our villages. So towards that objective, the BharatNet project is currently being implemented, which seeks to connect 600,000 villages with fiber net in the next 2 years. 200,000 villages are
Plus one.
yeah. So 200,000 villages are already connected. Now, and till such time that it happens, we have a network of what we call common service centers. We have 500,000 common service centers which are internet enabled, either broadband or fiber or 4G. And these are like run by entrepreneurs, private sector owned, private sector run. And they offer public services and private services. So that ensures that people who don't have connectivity, people who don't have a device, people who don't know how to navigate a portal or an app, they can go and get services in assisted mode. So that's one part of addressing inclusion. And of course, UPI kind of services have also brought in UPI 123, wherein you can access UPI services even on a future phones. So all that is part of the strategy, because without digital inclusion, we cannot move forward. And in inclusion, along with the connectivity, I'll also mention two other things, like making services available in all Indian languages. We are a huge country with 22 official languages. And number two, about which we are working on, is voice enablement of services, because very often people will not be able to key in or register on a portal or just type it on a device or a smartphone. They would want to access services just like you talk to a Siri or an Alexa. So Umang already has got around 30 odd services which are available through voice interface. So ultimately in the next 3 to 5 years, voice will become the key channel which will ensure inclusion along with connectivity. The second question with regard to the regulatory compliances, well, what I would say is that the kind of concessions which the startups and all have been given in almost every field is much more than what has been given anywhere else. When it comes to complying with certain laws, see, while promoting and collaborating is there, but at the same time, compliance to statutory provisions, compliance to the law of the land, to ensure that rights of the citizens are also protected is also very, very important. And at the same time, like if you look at like the Public Data Protection Bill, the bill was being debated for almost 4 years. It had become very kind of cumbersome because of extensive discussions, consultations. The government has withdrawn it and promised to bring in something which is much more simpler, which will reduce the cost of compliance. So that intent always remains. So whether it's taxation related concessions for startups, whether for public procurement, so several steps have been taken. But yes, if there are any other concerns, I'm sure DPIIT and Startup India are already engaged with the startups in addressing them. The third question was with regard to Swayam. Yes, Swayam is, the backend of Swayam is Microsoft. But if you look at the largest LMS platform that we are running, which is on Diksha for K to 12, it is run on an open source Sunbird platform, and that is addressing the needs of millions of students across the country. And during the pandemic, if education was sustained and if online education continued, Diksha played a big role on that. So that's the only time that Swayam will also move on to open source system. Government procurement sometimes works on a least cost method, and sometimes the proprietary software providers quote lesser than the open source, then that becomes the way. So this is what I wanted to add.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And with that, I think we've come to the end of this session. I want to thank all my panelists for a very involved, interesting, and intense conversation. Thank you.